In the Constituent Assembly, there was a language committee that was going to settle these things. So they unanimously ruled, to phase out English. They set a date, 1965. Sanskrit was supported by a number of surprising people, like Dr. Ambedkar, the leader of the ex-untouchables. So at that time, Sanskrit could easily have won. It didn't, because when the vote was 50-50, it was up to the chairman of the committee to cast the deciding vote, and he voted in favor of Hindi, which I think was a black day for India. The Arabic name Hind also referred to India as the source of wealth. So they looked up to India. You see nowadays in India you have the secularists who say, no, there was no India, there was no sense of unity in India and so on. Well, all those foreigners had no problem identifying India. But so it had a purely geographical meaning. Only in the time of partition, for a while, it acquired a bit of a, not for Hindus, but for Muslims, it acquired a bit of a communal meaning. And so there came an association, Pakistan Muslim, Hindustan Hindu. Bharata effectively means Veda-Land. You see, you can't divorce Indian history from Hinduism. Another thing typical for India is the language. Some languages are very visually recognizable, like Chinese. In the case of India, few people outside would know the Devanagari script, would not visually recognize whether it is, Sanskrit or Thai or Mongol or, something bizarre. But nevertheless, Sanskrit has a great prestige. To the east, it's mainly because of the Buddhist reason. Mahayana Buddhism had Sanskrit as its sacred language. So many people in China, Japan, and so on learned Sanskrit to familiarize themselves with the Buddhist tradition. In the West, it is mainly the linguistic role that Sanskrit has played in the creation of the linguistics as a science. Linguistics as a science started in the 19th century when Western scholars were discovering Sanskrit. And so all the concepts of Panini were immediately instrumentalized to analyze not just Indian, but all the world's languages. And so one of the first Sanskrit words that I've learned is a linguistic term, Sandhi, which is the harmonious, euphonic combination of vowels or consonants of succeeding words. So, we talk about Sanskrit. Sanskrit could have become the national language of India in 1947, and it almost did. Yes. So historically, of course, Sanskrit is the language of learning, often also of administration throughout India. And so then it, had a dip, let's say, under Muslim rule when it had no particular status anymore. Then it came back. Or it almost came back. You see, under the British at least, Hindu culture had been revived to some extent. Well, it's especially when Hindus themselves defeated the Mughals that Hinduism, came into its own again. But under the British, you see, their role was a bit ambiguous. On the one hand, they promoted English and thus made all the Indian languages look primitive and obsolete. On the other hand, they also patronized a lot of research, the discovery of the Arthashastra, the decipherment of the Brahmi script, the excavation of Mohenjo-Daro, and so on. At any rate, by 1947, Indians were ready to revive Sanskrit. So in the Constituent Assembly, there was a language committee that was going to settle these things. So they unanimously ruled, to phase out English. They set the date 1965. And then they had a choice to make. Are we going to take the most populous language in India, Hindi? At least if we assume that all those dialects of Awadhi and Bhojpuri and Marwari and so on really are dialects of one language, because that itself was being debated. But so if we conceive Hindi as such, then it's like 40% or so of the population that speak it, and most others also understand it. For Gujarati, Bengali and so on, it's not such a big jump to Hindi. Or are we going to choose Sanskrit? So that was the choice. There was a vote held on it. Sanskrit was supported by a number of surprising people, like Dr. Ambedkar, the leader of the ex-untouchables. Today, you see the movement that goes by his name, the Ambedkarites. If asked to, I expect that they would vehemently oppose Sanskrit. They would say, ugly, Brahminical. And the Christians and Muslims and so on would vehemently oppose it. Back then, the situation was very different. First of all, many more Hindus were familiar with Sanskrit than are today. Hindus generally were more religious than are today, and therefore more in awe of Sanskrit, even if they themselves didn't speak it. And then Dr. Ambedkar, in his childhood, you see, he had signed up in school for taking a course in Sanskrit. And he was, shunted away. They said, no, you take some other language, take Persian or so, because they felt that the language of the gods should not be soiled by some untouchable. Now, his conclusion was not what today's casteist politician would do. They did not say, oh, down with Sanskrit. On the contrary, he wanted to learn Sanskrit. And, he said, this has been denied by my parents and grandparents and so on. I want to, break through into the citadel of the upper caste. I want to learn Sanskrit. And that was his attitude then also in the Constituent Assembly. So he supported the choice of Sanskrit. There was also a Muslim leader who, and so on. There were a number of surprising supporters of Sanskrit. Moreover, Christians and Muslims who had an interest in opposing Sanskrit didn't do so or couldn't do so at the time because they were on the defensive. We're talking about the period 1947-1950. The Muslims had the odium on them of having supported Pakistan, of having caused all these, people fleeing and getting killed and so on. And so they were on the defensive. They were not in a mood to do much, to assert themselves. Similar with Christianity. You see, the missionaries were very much on the defensive, far more than other Indians. They realized what the world movement of decolonization would mean. They realized, for example, that at that very same time, in nearby China, there was a civil war going on between the communists and the official government. And wherever the communists took over, it was the end of the mission. The missionaries were very lucky if they could escape alive. And so everything that they had built up was immediately completely destroyed. So that could happen in India. They knew it. And so they were in no mood to, to irritate people by, for example, opposing their choice of language. So at that time, Sanskrit could easily have won. It didn't, because when the vote was 50-50, it was up to the chairman of the committee to cast the deciding vote, and he voted in favor of Hindi, which I think was a black day for India, because Sanskrit had a fighting chance of really being accepted as the link language, whereas Hindi, everybody reacted, why should one vernacular, not better than all the other vernaculars, be exalted above the others?
That's a fair argument, I believe.
That is an entirely fair argument. Moreover, Hindi had no prestige. Among the vernaculars, there was still a difference, like Bengali had prestige. But Hindi... And so, you see, Hindi never succeeded in its constitutional role of national language. Still contested, and by 1965, the Nehruvian anglicized elite was strong enough to sabotage the changeover that was planned for 1965 from English to Hindi. And so, just by presidential decree, with little democratic force really, it was decided that English would continue along with Hindi. But so, practice after more than 70 years teaches that this effectively is a formula for slow anglicization. Like higher education is mostly in English, so your elites are going to be very familiar in English. Often when they speak their mother tongue and they have to say anything serious, anything profound, they switch to English. Like, for instance, one time when it was really brought home to me, in 1998, Ram Swarup, a very important philosopher, died, and I was sitting in a meeting somewhere, and suddenly some peon came into the room, and he said, with a dramatic look on his face, Ram Swarup dead ho gaya. Speaking in Hindi, but once he had to say the word that was really the point, then he switched to English. And so you find that a lot, and even with very ordinary words that every Hindi speaker knows the Hindi word for, like numbers, when you say that, the party has won in the election, it has gotten, 80%, 80. No, they say 80. In the middle of a Hindi sentence, the important word is put in English. And so that shows a tendency that I only see increasing. In the 35 years that I've been coming to India, I see it getting worse and worse and worse. And I'm not going to give any solution for that. I have Indian friends who do work on that, but if there is no political power that really stands behind your solution, then your solution is going to remain purely theoretical. So the situation today is that slowly but surely India is sliding into the Anglosphere. But I don't know, many people who admire India on the outside don't know exactly what the situation is and will associate India more with Indian languages. So, that issue is still to be resolved. The capital of India. The oldest capital that we know of is of the Solar dynasty. You have the patriarch Manu, supposedly the founder of everything in India. And according to the Greek ambassador Megasthenes, he reported the stories that he heard in India. So this Manu must have been enthroned in 6776 BC.
So that's the current Manu you're talking about, Vaivasvat Manu.
Well, yeah, that's another story. Other Manus, you know, we're talking about the historical Manu. So he's dated at any rate very early. I mean, here I can't discuss the worth of what Megasthenes heard, but at any rate, he's quite ancient. Then he has a number of children. One of them is a daughter, Ila, and her son Pururavas founds the lunar dynasty, to which the Vedic seers belong. And her brother Ikshvaku, he founds the solar dynasty. Now the capital of that solar dynasty is Ayodhya. It's written that it is Ayodhya. We don't know if it is the present Ayodhya, because in the Ramayana there is a story that Rama's grandfather Aja moves the capital. And so it is quite possible that they took along the name, but that the places they put their capital, you know, was different after every few generations. So we have an Ayodhya there. We certainly have it. I mean, it's archaeologically verified. But I mean, during the Ram Janmabhoomi agitation, of course, it was research threadbare. But nevertheless, the first Ayodhya it remains a challenge for archaeologists to find that. You see, maybe Ikshvaku lived somewhere else. Anyway, so that's where the story of India's capitals starts. The Vedic seers lived in northern Haryana, in an area about as big as Belgium. To insinuate my country's name into this story of India. And so they speak of a central area called Ilaspada. I don't know if you can call that the capital. You know, it was the central place for them. Ilaspada means the footprint of Ila, which is their ancestress, which is more or less where later the city Kurukshetra, maybe that's one and the same city that was renamed after the son or grandson or so of King Kuru renamed the city after him. At any rate, it's in that area. I've been there a few times, you know, at conferences in the university there, and I felt so at home there. Love the place. That same dynasty, the Bharata dynasty, so they live there in northern Haryana. Then they move when that area desiccates and, you know, becomes less hospitable. Many people migrate both to the west, to the far west, all the way to Syria, the Mitanni kingdom, and to Babylon, the Kassites, but also to the east and to the far east, all the way to Magadha, to Bengal and so on. But also closer by, Hastinapura is where you now have the city of Meerut on the Ganga. So that's the next capital that is of some importance in Indian history. There are two cousin branches in this kingdom. So the Kauravas are living there in the capital. Their Pandava cousins go in exile, and then while they found a new capital, which is Indraprastha, the colony of the storm god Indra. And that's not very far from here, because we are at the moment in Delhi, and so this is Indraprastha. And indeed, it would be perfectly fine if Allahabad can be rebaptized as Prayagraj, then maybe Delhi could also be renamed as Indraprastha. That would make perfect sense. That would do justice to history. And so now that we're talking about Delhi, let's look at the future of that city. So later on, Delhi becomes the capital of the Sultanate, then of much of the Mughal Empire. There are some interruptions with the capital in Agra or in Fatehpur Sikri, but it's in this area that the Mughals remain. At the time the city has changed its name, it becomes Dhlika or ultimately Delhi. And I've looked around, for an explanation of that name Delhi, and I find no agreement. There are many theories, some obviously flaky, some are serious attempts, but I'm not sure. Like for instance, there is one that says it means literally the heart of the hill. Now, heart apparently refers to the Persian Urdu word dil, like dilchasp, seizing the heart, meaning, making you enthusiastic. But so I don't think that that's it. So there are a number of, non-serious ones. One that looks suspiciously serious is that it is related to the name that you now know in the northwest of India, Dhillon. Now, many Punjabis are called Dhillon. And so that is originally the name of one of the sub-tribes of the Scythians who entered northwest India like more than 2,000 years ago.
They are also the long lost cousins of the Vedic people, the Scythians.
Yeah, that's of course a long story, but yes, of course. So the Scythians are one of the Iranian tribes, and the Iranians are the cousins of the Vedic tribe. So ultimately they're all connected, that's true. But so they go to Central Asia, and then much later they come back. Like for instance, you have the Jats. Jat is simply the Sanskrit pronunciation of Getai, and so they're also an Iranian tribe. They enter history when they revolt against the first Achaemenid emperor Cyrus. In fact, they defeat him and kill him. But then it becomes too dangerous for them to remain in the Persian Empire, so they come to India. And there they become the Jats. Totally assimilating same language, same food and everything as their neighbors, but still, thanks to the caste system, retaining their identity, their collective identity. So that's a possibility that that particular community for a while was in control of the city and gave it its name. It's a possibility. So here about the name Delhi, I only provisional. This is not sure. The first capital of more than half of India, because these initial capitals that we mentioned only controlled less than what is now a province of India. The first one that controlled more than half of the subcontinent was based in Pataliputra, where you get the first empires, the Nanda Empire, then the Maurya Empire, later on the Gupta Empire. So they start conquering all of India. None of them succeed in conquering and really unifying the whole of India, but it gets closer and closer. So Pataliputra is present-day Patna. I know Patna is the capital of Bihar, which has a bit of a bad reputation.
Sadly so.
But, I once knew a Dutch Hindustani girl, that is to say coming from Suriname and ultimately coming from the UP-Bihar border area. And she had a big inferiority complex about her name. She was called Bihari. So she'd never been there, but she'd heard that Bihar had a not so successful reputation. So, we went through the whole history of Bihar and we realized that Bihar actually is India's major claim to fame. You see, it's not only the first empires that come from there. which already is something that outsiders would admire. But India also has this spiritual ambition. So Buddhism comes from there, Jainism comes from there. The Buddha grew up in Kapila Vastu. That is to say, the habitat of Kapila. You know, they built their town in a piece of land that Kapila had given them, the sage Kapila. Now, who is Kapila? You see, he's the face of the Sankhya philosophy, which is India's oldest philosophy, and which is the worldview behind yoga, which is also a global success story, which has a very good reputation. Then Vedanta also comes from northwestern Bihar. There you had the court of Janaka, King Janaka. So he hosted this debate with Gargi and some other famous names, and with Yajnavalkya. Yajnavalkya was a very orthodox Vedic sage. He had written the Shatapatha Brahmana. So he lived originally in western UP, and he went for this debate to Bihar, and it is there that he develops a new thing, namely Vedanta. The Upanishadic thought he writes, or about him is written the first Upanishad, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, which is the source of Atmavada, the doctrine of the self, which is the start of, well, almost all of Indian philosophy, but certainly of the Vedanta school. That too, and that also is very well reputed worldwide. You know, according to the German philosopher Schopenhauer, it was the highest that the human mind had ever produced. That comes from Bihar. Look, you know, what would India be without Bihar?
So the transition from the Vedantic thought process to the Upanishadic thought process, that current identity of Hindu as a religion, if you may say.
Yeah.
So we say that the capital is Kashi. It is also near
Yeah, that's also
Bihar.
near, yes.
King Janaka's
Right.
kind of capital.
Yeah, anyway, so that's that area has, deserves a far better reputation than it currently has. Now, incidentally, we can contrast Patna with Delhi. Delhi, I don't know if it has a good reputation, but certainly it's an important place. And nevertheless, it also has a bit of a negative reputation if you look closer. This fellow from Hyderabad, Giridhar Mamidi, he has written a paper about the Delhi jinx, the curse upon Delhi. That you see everything associated with Delhi ultimately goes wrong. And so he shows throughout history that everybody associated with Delhi ends up in misery. And so, for the Pandavas, their time in Delhi was not their best time. And then later on, you see the Delhi Sultanate is the most cruel regime that India has ever known. When the Mughals stay in Delhi, they come on the defensive. They start losing against the Marathas, then the British, and then the British. You see, when they have their capital in Kolkata, everything goes well, and they expand and they become richer, and you see every beggar can take service in India and become someone, and so on. And their power grows, they gradually conquer all of India, and they get prosperous in India and all that. And then they move the capital to Delhi, and then the decline starts. They have to face the freedom movement that becomes ever stronger. And meanwhile, worldwide, they have wars and so on that, make it difficult for them to keep power in India. Ultimately, they have to give up. So, if only they had never settled in Delhi. So, I don't know, but according to Vastu Shastra and, the knowledge of the the habitat of the geographical directions. You see, Delhi clearly is not the right place for the capital of India. Maybe Pataliputra or so would be better, or Ujjain, which has never been the political capital, but the astronomical and geographical capital, the Greenwich of India. Or so, I mean, I leave that entirely to Indians to find out for themselves. But so, think about it. Maybe Delhi is not the best choice. I also have to mention the first international capital in India, the capital where more than 50% of the territory was outside India. And this is the Chola Empire. The Cholas more or less colonized Southeast Asia, big parts of Myanmar, of Indochina, of Indonesia. And so their capital was Thanjavur in Tamil Nadu. Okay, that's the capitals of India. Now we come to a really interesting point. The name India. So it's very straightforward what the story of the name is. It comes from Sindhu, the Sindhu River, which is now mostly in Pakistan. A little bit of it in Kashmir. It's probably, according to linguist Paul Thieme, comes from a verb sed, which means to move. And that would be a logical name for a river. At any rate, is the name of that river. So regardless of its etymology, it comes from the name of that river.
Considered to be a male principle, that a male river.
Oh yeah, yes. Most rivers have a feminine ending. Okay, yeah, interesting. Now, in Persian, this same name was pronounced as Hindu, so the S becomes aspiration H, and the aspirated sound D becomes unaspirated D. So you have Hindu. So Hindu means the Sindhu River, and by extension, the land around the Sindhu River, the people who live on the Sindhu River side or beyond, looked at from Persia. So that becomes the name India. It has no religious meaning, it's just a geographical term. The word is taken over by its neighbors. The Chinese take it over in the form Intu, which still today is the name for India in Chinese. Then in Arabic, it is Al-Hindu. That's how it's more formally pronounced, but colloquially it is pronounced Al-Hind. So the Arabs interpreted the U at the end as the nominative ending. So you have a case system in Arabic with 3 cases: nominative, genitive, accusative. And so the ending for the nominative is U. Like for instance in Allahu Akbar. So colloquially you say Allah, but specifically, informally, Allahu. So this Al-Hindu, or pronounced Al-Hind, becomes the name of India. There are also some derived words, like the root Hind, which you see in the word Mohandis, which is an engineer, that ultimately refers to India. So India was the country of science. And, Hindsa means physics. And even more interestingly, there is a rather common girl's name in Arabic, Hind. And girls' names in all languages are often indicative of wealth, of happiness, and so on. Like, for instance, Kimberley in English refers to a diamond mine. in South Africa. Or Kim in Korean is in fact the Chinese word anciently Kiam, now pronounced Jin, which means gold. Or among the Greeks already, you had the name Lydia, which refers to the country Lydia in what is now Turkey, which was proverbially rich. That's where King Croesus came from, who was, associated with wealth. So the Arabic name Hind also referred to India as the source of wealth. That's what India was known for. The country where spices came from, where jewels came from. So they looked up to India, that's absolutely. And then the Greeks took it over, Indos, that becomes the source of all the European words, India in Latin and so on. And they had no problem identifying India on the map to the extent that those things existed already. You see nowadays in India you have the secularists who say, no, there was no India, there was no sense of unity in India and so on. Well, all those foreigners had no problem identifying India. And they knew when they landed on the coast in Kerala, or they traveled all the way up to Kashmir, that this was all India. But so it had a purely geographical meaning. From Hindu, the Persians also developed the word Hindustan, which has actually just the same meaning. So Stan means country, Hindustan, the country of the Indians, which is India. But so that's a purely geographical term. It retains that meaning, well, essentially till today. You see, if Mr. Owaisi or whatever, any Indian Muslim goes to Arabia on pilgrimage and the Arabs ask him, where are you from? They will all say, from Hindustan. That's the name India in Urdu. Only in the time of partition, for a while, it acquired a bit of a, not for Hindus, but for Muslims, it acquired a bit of a communal meaning. You had, on the one hand, Pakistan, and on the other, you had Hindustan. And so there came an association, Pakistan Muslim, Hindustan Hindu. And so if any committed Hindu, anyone known as a defender of the Hindu cause, dares to use the word Hindustan, then tomorrow some editorial is going to, cast aspersions on this and suggest that this expresses some communal intention. But so that's not really there. Well, yes, you see, the word Hindustan nowadays is sometimes used in contradistinction with Pakistan. And so the way Pakistan has a very explicitly Muslim meaning, like as the slogan says, Pakistan ka matlab kya? La ilaha illallah. What's the meaning of Pakistan? There is no God but Allah. Okay? So the suggestion is that Hindustan has a similar meaning on the Hindu side. Now that's just not true. The word was not coined by Hindus, is rarely used by Hindus, mostly an Urdu term. And so it never had a communal meaning. It's only at the time when Pakistan was created in the 1940s that, many people used it as the opposite of Pakistan. But so nowadays, secularist journalists and so on are often going to insinuate that anyone, at least anyone they hate, any Hindu, uses the word Hindustan, then it must have some sinister communal meaning. So maybe it helps to simply use the native term Bharata, or more completely Bharatvarsha. Now, Bharata is a derivative of Bharata. So Bharata means the land of Bharata, or the dynasty of Bharata, or the descendants of Bharata. But who is this Bharata? Now, Bharata is a fairly common name, and there are many Bharatas in Indian history, like Bharata, the younger brother of Rama. And so all those Bharatas are named after some original Bharata. Like every Alexander in the world is named after Alexander of Macedon. When you wonder aloud where does this Bharata come from, the people volunteer an etymology. And a very common one I hear is Bharata. Bha meaning light in Sanskrit, and Rata meaning oriented towards or something like that. It can even mean having intercourse with. But so Bharata would mean light oriented. And so there they give it some deep spiritual meaning. Yeah. But a better etymology, and so folk etymologies are very common in ancient scripture in every language. Like the name Yahweh, meaning God in the Bible, is a folk etymology. You know, there's a long story, other occasion. But so this is very common. And so in the Vedas also you have many of these not so serious etymologies, either meant seriously but wrong, or also meant just jocularly. But you see, a better etymology derives it from the verbal root bhr, which means to carry, which is a normal Indo-European root, like it's related to Latin ferre, which means to carry, like in transfer. And so it means something that is carried, something that is maintained, which is an indirect term for fire, because fire has to be taken care of. You know, like in the old days when people didn't master fire very well. You know, if you had the good luck of witnessing a lightning that set fire to a tree, then you had to, you know, take a branch that was burning and then keep the fire alive. Okay? So therefore one of the names for fire could be Bharata. And so maybe some father named his newborn son Bharata. That's realistic. Anyway, the importance of this Bharata is not the etymology of his name, but what he did. So he did something very special. You see, India was not named after Chandragupta, great conqueror, you know, or other kings who did the usual worldly things that successful kings do. He did something else, and something more important and more enduring than conquer. Who is this Bharata? He was one scion in the long succession of kings of the Paurava sub-tribe of the lunar dynasty. And what did he do? At his court there was a priest called Bharatvarsha. According to a later story told in the Mahabharata, and you have to be careful, you know, this may be historical, this may be fanciful, but according to that story, he was the adoptive son of King Bharata. Anyway, he was close to Bharata. He writes about Bharata as Bharata of old. Like today we say the late Bharata. So, you know, he's dead now, but I've still known him. That's when you say this expression, the late. So what he does is he founds the Vedic tradition. You see, the very first Vedic hymns were written by his court poet. And so that for some centuries remains the big thing of the dynasty that he starts, the Bharata dynasty, with long A. So effectively, this says something about why India is called Bharata. So we know very little about him. I'll come in a minute to why this explains the name Bharata. There are a few sources about this Bharata that many people cite. Last year, there was a celebration presided over by Draupadi Murmu, who is the president of this country. And so the official invitation, not only in Hindi but also in English, said that Draupadi Murmu, the president of Bharat, invites you, blah, 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 blah. So Bharat was introduced on the stage as the name of India. Now, there is no problem that people use Bharat when they speak Hindi or Tamil or whatever. But to impose that on a foreign language, that's a bit questionable. Like, for instance, many countries have exonyms, have names used by foreigners that differ sharply from the name that they give themselves. Like, Germany is called something totally different in Italian, in English, in Russian, and everywhere. A number of many different names. China is not called China in Chinese. It's called Zhongguo. And, this counts for Hungary, for example, is Magyarország. And so many countries have some exonym. There is one country, to my knowledge, that insists on having its own name used also in foreign languages. That's Turkey. So Turkey in Turkish is Türkiye. And so nowadays you can hear, news stories about, the export of Germany to Türkiye has risen so many percent. Now, Germany is an exonym. They don't say Deutschland. No, they say Germany as is common in English. Yet they don't say Turkey. They have imposed on them Türkiye. Okay, and that's, I don't know, what is the fuss about. And so to insist on having people say Bharat when they would naturally say India, I have double feelings about that. Anyway, but you can do it, of course. Everybody at any rate understands when you say Draupadi Murmu, president of Bharat. So then you see a bit of discussion erupted in the media. And so some people took some passage from the Mahabharata saying that this Bharata was the son of Dushyanta and Shakuntala, and with the detail that Shakuntala was the daughter of Vishwamitra. Now, Vishwamitra, I don't know of any Vishwamitra except for the Vedic seer Vishwamitra, the author of the Gayatri Mantra. But of course, he came after the first Rishi. Okay, he's one in the series of Rishis, but so they came after Bharadvaj, the adoptive son of Bharata. So he was definitely not the grandfather-in-law, or what is it? The grandfather, yes, of Bharata. So that's a bit of a garbled story that at any rate came more than 1,000 years later. Even later, 2,000-3,000 years later, is the Vishnu Purana, which says that Bharata was the son of Vrshabha, whom the giants identify as their first Tirthankara, their first guru. And so this guru may well be dated very early, but to make him the father of the Vedic king is very unlikely, because the giants started in Bihar, remember? Which is 1,000 kilometers away from Haryana, where you have the Vedic people. So nothing is impossible, but you see so many stories in the Puranas prove unreliable, and this may very well be one of them. Anyway, what we do have from very close by, eyewitness testimony, is precisely in the Vedas, this one little snippet of information where Bharatvarsha mentions Bharata of old, the late Bharata, whom he associates with the fire cult, which also helps explain why his name, is analyzed as meaning fire. But so the fire cult, of course, is essential to the Vedic tradition. And so let's settle for that. You see what these later Puranas and so on say, keep it in mind, but don't believe it too much. So this much we know, he is associated with the Vedic tradition. That is why his name becomes the national name of India. Bharata effectively means Veda-Land. Now imagine if Prime Minister Modi had announced to the world, Draupadi Murmu, the president of Veda-Land, is going to have blah, blah, blah. You see, then the Times of India and so on, they would have reacted a bit more negatively, I suppose. They would have shouted, communal. But that's effectively what Bharata means. You see, you can't divorce Indian history from Hinduism. Okay, now through his descendants, Bharata becomes rather important, even politically, because one of the descendants is Sudas, who wins the Battle of the Ten Kings. So his kingdom expands to cover most of northwest India. The Sudas gets known as a Chakravartin, literally a wheel turner, which means an emperor, one to whom many local kings pledge allegiance. So this is in fact this is formalized in the Vedic tradition with the horse sacrifice. So you let a horse roam free for 1 year, and everywhere where he comes, the local king has to either fight to defend himself or pledge allegiance, pay tribute to the emperor who offers the sacrifice. And so many little countries keep their swadharma, their own ways, their own laws and so on, but become part formally of a larger empire. And so that empire is ruled by a Chakravartin. Then that expansion gets stalled by the war that has become the subject matter of the Mahabharata. But nevertheless, they keep expanding culturally, because by that time, the Vedic tradition is fully formed. You have a whole class of people who gradually become the Brahmin caste that specializes in memorizing the Vedas, reciting the Vedas. And so everyone who hears of this wants to be part of this. So you get kings in South India who invite Brahmin families, give them tax exemption and give them agraharas, separate neighborhoods to live in, just to give the Vedic prestige, the prestige of the Vedic tradition, to their dynasty. So yes, you see, all of India was conquered, not by military force, but on the contrary, by invitation. People wanted the Vedic tradition to come to their country. So the word Bharatvarsha, for a while, mostly the first millennium BC, gets used in two senses. One is the political empire of the Bharata dynasty, which is not so large, and even as late as the 1st century BCE, we find some texts in which Bharatvarsha is meant as northwest India, stopping about the Salanira River, the border between what is now Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. And at the same time, of course, it gains a cultural meaning which increasingly coincides with the subcontinent. So, at least 2000 years ago, there was a sense of unity all over India. Not yet political unity, only cultural unity, which was cemented by the pilgrimage cycles. People went to all the places associated with Shiva, or people who were more attached to the goddess went to the places, the Shakti peaks, the places of the goddess, and so on. But so more and more and more people made themselves at home in India as a whole. This situation is unhistorically back projected onto the Pandava or the Mahabharata age, when you have stories like the Pandavas conquering every corner of India. So that's not exactly what happened, but it shows that by the time the Mahabharata gets completed, the writers are fired up with this idea of Indian unification. So you get an ideal of political unification, and so you see that the Maurya dynasty almost succeeds in realizing it. They control far more than half of India. Okay. Now, next to Bharatvarsha, we have another term, Jambudvipa. Jambudvipa has, in fact, two meanings. Either the larger continent of which the subcontinent or South Asia is a part. You see the whole Eurasian landmass. It is said about this, realistically, that it is rabbit-shaped. So if you take a photograph from outer space of this landmass, you could see a rabbit in it. Similarly, about India, it is said that it is bow-shaped. If you stretch a bow, it looks a bit like the shape of India. Okay, Jambudvipa. Dvipa is an island or a landmass of the Jambu. What is this? It's a tree with a specific fruit. So it's a specific berry. One translation I've seen is the rose apple. Now, frankly, I don't know much about fruits, but one of these berries. And so Jambudvipa is used for the whole continent, or it is also used specifically for the subcontinent. Interestingly, I've had a question whether the name Jumbo, meaning something very big, like in jumbo jet, isn't derived from this. And I've thought about it, and I think no, it is not derived from this. You see, in English, this word jumbo refers to a 19th century circus elephant that really existed and that had been imported from Africa. And so the name has nothing to do with India. It comes from the name of some idol existing on one African tribe, certainly not all through Africa.
The elephant is called Jumbo in Swahili language, like Simba.
Yeah.
And there is a similarity, not Jumbo, but Simha is derived from Sanskrit Simha.
Well, about Simba, meaning lion in some African language, being derived from Sanskrit Singha, I am not so sure. Again, nothing is impossible, but you see, Africans are so familiar with lions that they don't need to borrow a foreign word for their lions. Anyway, non-committal. The English expression mumbo jumbo refers to that same idol. Mumbo jumbo is the incomprehensible muttering of a priest in front of this idol. The mantras that he, recites. So at any rate, it has a different origin than India. So no Jambudvipa. Nevertheless, there is also, I don't remember exactly where, but it is written somewhere that the berries growing on this tree are as large as an elephant. So who knows? Who knows?